Our gospel text today begins with a note about placement. Jesus is in the midst of a great crowd of people. He looks out at them and he senses their needs. And then he goes up onto a hill that overlooks this crowd, and he sits down, and the disciples come to him. In the synagogues in that day, whenever the scripture was read, someone would stand behind a pulpit or lectern like this, and the scroll of the scripture would be unrolled, and a person would read from the text. But whenever it was time for the rabbi to interpret the text, the rabbi would sit down. Disciple means student. So in this passage, Matthew is telling us that the Rabbi Jesus is going to instruct his students, the disciples. And so he is speaking to the disciples in this passage, but he's doing so with the crowd in his mind. He's saying to them, this is who you are as disciples, and this is the role that you will grow into, and this is who you will be among the people who are here today. The term beatitude comes from the term blessed be, or blessed are you, which is used throughout this. And the Beatitudes are not cause and effect. Jesus isn't saying here, if you do this, then this will happen to you. But rather it is because you are a disciple, because of who you are, this statement is true for you. You are a peacemaker, and that means you are doing God's work. You are currently in mourning, and so God is actively working within you to comfort you. You hunger and thirst for righteousness, and you know that it is God's Spirit that can satisfy that hunger the way nothing else can. You are the poor in spirit, and that makes you a citizen of God's kingdom. Throughout the Psalms, the poor are seen as being closer to God. And part of that has to do with the fact that the more we have, the more potential false idols we can surround ourselves with. It also shows God's sympathy towards the poor and the oppressed, those that society might overlook or victimize, as we read about in the other Old Testament text. God specifically looks out for them. And in Matthew's version of the Beatitudes, which differs a bit from Luke's version, they're all spiritualized. So he's talking in this case about the poor in spirit, those whose spirits are impoverished. If we go back to the wilderness time, that 40-year period between leaving slavery in Egypt and occupying the Promised Land, God cared for the people by giving them manna, that mysterious heavenly substance that they gathered 6 days a week and used to make bread. That was what fed them and kept them alive. There are many ways to interpret this. But one thing that's going on is that the generation that was in the wilderness is a generation that learned what it meant to live life completely depending on God for survival. So that the generation that follows them and will live in the Promised Land is one who will inherit this behavior of living with complete dependence on God. Jesus is saying to the disciples, you are people who depend on God, and God will fill you, and God will satisfy you. When the Hebrews made it to the threshold of the Promised Land, spies were sent into the land, and they came back with a bunch of grapes that was so large it took 2 men carrying a pole between them to carry it in. And the people were amazed at the bounty of what the Promised Land had to offer. But they were also afraid of who they might face and who they would have to fight. Jesus is saying to the disciples, you, the poor in spirit, you are citizens of God's kingdom. You know what it's like to live with complete dependence on God, like your ancestors learned in the wilderness. Today we come to this table of grace and we receive a piece of bread. And we remember what our ancestors did so many centuries ago. And it represents our total dependence on God. That through God we can be fulfilled spiritually in ways that nothing else can. And instead of bunches of grapes, we have the fruit of the vine in the cup. That foreshadows the coming world that we will experience, our own promised land. That time that we talk about in the liturgy, when Christ comes in final victory and we all feast at his heavenly banquet. It is a promise of what is to come, a land where there is no more pain, no more tears, and no more death. And we are trepidatious about entering into that land. We are afraid of leaving behind what we already know so well. But like our ancestors, we will not have to fight and shed blood in order to enter into that world that is to come. Because it is Christ's blood which is shed, which brings us into the world. Today we come to the table for the gifts of bread and the vine, because they are the gifts of the poor of spirit. They are the gifts of us who live in the kingdom of God, now and for eternity. Amen.